although this first presentation and especially Joyce's last presentation has a little more depth. So that kind of sets the stage. So there are PDFs, as Brian Krug said, that you can download, that the slide masters that you can use also to follow along. In addition, on Wednesday morning, we sent out an eGrow alert or an eGrow research update, and it's on the eGrow.org website. There are the PDFs of the PGR rate guides, the brand new one that just came out on greenhouse crops, and then last year's that Joyce Latimer did for perennial. So those resources are also there at the eGrow.org website under the research tab. So let's get started. So want to thank you for joining us. So it's kind of hard to say good morning because last week when we did the webinar, we had some Europeans on it, which would have been for them good afternoon. So I'm going to talk about the goals and other benefits of PGRs. So when you look at PGRs and what's occurring, I want a term that we're looking at BMPs, best management practices. These are some of the other attributes that you get from using a PGR. So I want to go through the growth control and some of these other attributes that we're looking at. What we want to try to avoid is that stretch, that long stem occurring on those plants by managing that growth. That's the key of using a plant growth regulator, and it gives you that management. It's a management tool that you can use to improve crop quality. Otherwise, on some crops, you might want to use the chainsaw, but you have to do some structural effects. And there are structural chemicals that Joyce Latimer is going to talk about in one of the presentations today. But PGRs can replace some of that manual labor, that lost growth, and the potential of that plant. And so that's what we're going to focus on. So PGRs are tools that make growing easier. And so by understanding how they work, we can control some of this excessive growth. And so I want to go over some background, some biochemical background that we're looking at with gibberellins. There's a pathway, a metabolic pathway in the plant. It's a chain of events which lead the production of gibberellins. And this particular hormone stimulates cell elongation. So if we control that hormone, and in the case of these PGRs, we're controlling so there's not quite as much being produced. We're not totally shutting it off. And so by cutting it, decreasing it, we control some of that excessive stretch that occurs on those plants. And so when you look at some of these PGRs, we are inhibiting that production of gibberellin, so the plants therefore are smaller. That the cells that are coming off that growing tip were affecting how much they end up growing. And so to see that, this is my rendition artistically, and I'm not an artist, of a growing tip of cells. And so that new cell, as it's starting to expand, when you don't apply a PGR, it gets big. But with a PGR, you make it, or you keep it smaller. It does not expand as much. And so you can see this, and now this is a case where they were trying to overcome a problem, but they applied GA and it really didn't work because the plants were stalled. But you can see by applying GA, you get that stretch. We're actually applying chemicals to control stretch overall, but you can see the effects that GA has on plant growth. So with cellular action that's going on, the expansion or that size of that cell varies, not the number of cells. So that there's still 3 cells stacked up in that stem versus shorter ones when you use a plant growth regulator. So we're not changing the genetic makeup, we're just changing the level of expansion of those cells, and so therefore the plants are smaller. So you can see that many times if you miss a few plants when you're applying a PGR, that without a PGR, the leaves are bigger, like you see there on the left, versus smaller, more compact leaves of the plant with the plant on the right, because that one had a PGR applied to it. So when we're looking specifically at chemicals that affect that GA pathway, there is a subset. Acimidol, which the original one was ARES, chloramiquat chloride, which cyclocel, Diminozide's B9, top floor's 4-pyrimidol. The original paclobutrazol was Bonsai, and Sumagic was the original uniconazole. And so those are the chemicals we're looking at that's there. And so when you look at those chemicals, and I also might want to point out that we didn't see the structural ones that were on that list. An Agio, a Florel, a Configure was not on that list. They're not anti-GA PGRs. But on that list, these are the cell elongation inhibitors, and they are further subdivided into 3 groups. Group A, which is basically chlormequat. Group B, acimidol, 4-pyrimidol, paclo, uniconazole, and finally Group C is dimizide B9. So there's a reason why these are in 3 subgroups, and that goes down to this graphic here in the middle of the slide. These are different chemicals that are produced in the metabolic pathway of the cell. So one leads to the next, that's the green arrow, and then finally you get gibberellins at the bottom. So if we apply a PGR like acimidol, paclobutrazol, uniconizoles, or 4-pyrimidol, they all block that pathway at 3 key points altogether. That's why they're grouped together as those 4 together as a group. And so when you block that, you decrease the amount of gibberellins that are produced, and therefore the plant's smaller. So you have less shoot growth. And so consequently, if you are looking then at chlormequat, that blocks the pathway further up. And when you look at dimidazide, it blocks the pathway further down. So there are 3 different points where these chemicals act, and that's why they're classified in 3 different subgroups. And so when you have this type of a setup, you can have that synergy effect. That's why we mix cyclocel with B9, because it hits the pathway at 2 places, 2 parts. 1 part plus 1 part gives you 3 parts of control, especially in the case of cyclocel and B9 when it comes to poinsettias. That's that synergy that we would like to see happening, and that's why it's occurring, because we're blocking that pathway at different points. So we're going to use this pathway on a few other examples as we're coming up. So we're not going to go away from it yet. So on that pathway, GA is the plant hormone that affects cell elongation. And by using these anti-GAs, we're blocking that pathway, we're limiting the amount of cell elongation that occurs. Now, each one varies slightly of where that blockage is, and because of that, we can have some synergy effects by using tank mixes for those plants. So now, I want to shift a little more into how PGRs work. So the main things that we're looking at for best management practices are growth control. Shorter plants, smaller diameter, but we got a lot of PGRs in that toolbox, the overall toolbox. We also have some that can make the plants taller. So we can stimulate the growth, like a fresco, a fascination application. We also can affect flowering. We also can influence the overall architecture. So there's a lot of different attributes that are there. And so you got a pretty darn full toolbox when you look at PGRs, especially in the United States, because we have a lot of them registered. There's a lot less that are registered in Europe, that there are fewer options available. So overall, like I said, growth control, from going from the plant on the left that's very big to one of the sizes, either the middle or the one on the right. Depending on what type of market you have, you want to control that growth, get a better quality plant that's easier to manage for you in the greenhouse and also for the consumer. And so, of course, that happens because we're blocking that pathway with these various chemicals, and we get that growth control. And we covered that in just the last few minutes. Other attributes that aren't GA pathway oriented but configure, you can increase the number of flower buds on those phylloclades. So 100 part per million configure on the right, there's about 5 or 6 buds there compared to 2 with the one on the left. So improving plant flowering capacity. You can also increase the number of chicks or offsets. And so here with 400 part per million, on green will, we had about a 4x increase in the number of chicks. It fills the pot out better. It's a better looking product for sale. And if you're a propagator, you have more chicks or pups to take off and use for your next line of propagation. So again, you can affect the overall plant attributes by using some of these PGRs. Some of the other added benefits we look at is a greener color and also disease fighting capacity. So have you ever noticed when you apply a PGR, especially maybe if you missed one and on the bench and that one's a lighter green like the plant on the left versus a darker green like the plant on the right, you get an improvement of leaf quality. Basically, there's an upbeat of chlorophyll that's being produced with that plant. You also, this especially applies to the acimidols, fluoropyrimidol, and paclobutrazol, but it does not apply to uniconazole because of where the chemicals are their class. There is some disease fighting potential there. It's not a huge amount, but there is some there to overcome some disease pressure. So you can see powdery mildew developing on the plant on the left. And this was a drench application with the plant on the right. It wasn't a foliar spray. So there is a little capacity there, but it certainly doesn't replace overall fungicide applications. But the reason for that is that there's the pathway in the middle. We blocked it with that big box, brown box in the middle, but it's like a beaver dam going on a stream. You don't stop the water flowing in the creek, you divert it. Well, a diversion is an uptick in chlorophyll, which is the darker green coloration. That's why it's darker green. And another diversion is that for some of the building blocks that are needed for fungi are blocked. So you have some increased disease fighting capacity occurring. So that's what's happening all with the GA pathway. Now, the last few years, we had a visiting professor from Pakistan, Dr. Ahmad. He was working with John Dole, and so we got together and decided to look at some other attributes of PGRs. We wanted to look at water use efficiency, post-harvest life, and nutrient utilization. So I want to share with you some of the results of those experiments that we've done over the last few years. So the first question we had is, do PGRs improve water use efficiency? There's indication in the literature that yes, it does. Some of the old studies were on non-floriculture crops and at extremely high levels. So we wanted to see at the levels we use, do we see the effects? So the reason this is happening is when you block that pathway in the middle, you have an uptick of abscisic acid. And that helps regulate cell opening and closures, which affects water loss. In addition, there is a blockage of the breakdown of that built up abscisic acid occurring. So you get what you get uptick to produce, it sticks around. And so we see that effect occurring by applying a PGR. In the case here, we're looking at total water uptake in liters for paclobutrazol drenched zinnias of 0, 0.51 or 2 milligrams AI. Now, about 0.5 was the optimal rate. So what we saw with that optimal rate was about 30% decrease in water use. So you're getting better water use efficiency of those plants. And furthermore, as a general rule, this, it's a little taller of a plant. The top line is height. The blue line is water use change. So if we saw a plant that had 30% less height, you usually are going to get slightly more, like 32% improvement in water use efficiency. So you can kind of use it as the same general rule that's going on for most bigger plants. So you already know that you're getting a 20% less growth on your plant X in your greenhouse. You can pretty well bank you're using 20% water also to produce that plant. So I basically said that we saw a decrease in water use, and that percentages basically are about the same, water use reduction equaling the amount of growth control that's there. So we did in fact see that PGRs as an added benefit do improve water use efficiency. We also saw that when you take those plants in the landscape, because it's using less water, they don't wilt as quickly, so therefore you don't have the drought stress. So those plants for the consumer, and we're talking optimal rates here, that those plants will establish better in the landscape. So because of the blockage of that gibberellin, we had an uptick of abscisic acid there to the right, and then we have tougher plants that are being produced. So we see an improvement in quality. So we also had the question, do PGRs improve shipping shelf life? So we applied Piccolo 10X and Magellan Zinnias as a regular spray during production. Then we brought the plants into the, they were ready to ship and did a post-harvest simulated shipping study. So the initial data, as we increased the pack load from 0 to 2 milligrams, what did we see? The plants got shorter or were shorter. The plant diameters were less. So that's the normal growth control you'd see with a PGR. You'd expect that. We also saw that when after those plants went through that simulated shipping, you saw less stress or stretch. It was 5.8 centimeters for the untreated control versus half that amount for the 0.5. So the plant did not stretch in that post-harvest shipping, the box or the shipping truck. You also saw that leaf color retention was better. There was a slight fading with the untreated control. The other ones had a better coloration. And in addition, the days until the first wilt, or then we rehydrated and wilted again, for either of them, you had more days on that shelf before that plant wilted. So you're not going to have them dry down and die as quickly. So there's an improvement of quality that's there. We also looked at ethylene. The question was, well, does a PGR overcome some ethylene effects? So the back row got ethylene treatment, the front an exposure, and the front row did not. As you can see, it did not offset the negative effects of ethylene. But when we looked at things because of that simulated shipping, we did have darker green color of those plants, and there was a slightly better retention of those flowers on those plants that went through shipping. So if you have ethylene exposure, this is not going to solve the problem, but offset that problem, but it's going to help keep those plants in good shape. And again, these PGRs were applied normally early on in the production cycle. These are residual effects that have continued once we started entering shipping. So the PGR was not applied right before the plants were shipped. So then the other question we have is, do PGRs improve nutrient use efficiency? Now, we did a side study and we compared the nutrient levels in an untreated plant versus some plants that had a bonsai drench. And the drench rate was a little high, and so we would have used a little slightly lower, but we have some values that were there. And so when you look at nutrient levels for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the second column is the untreated control. You can see the values compared to if the bonsai drench was used. And we see an increase of all those elements in that tissue along with the plant being smaller, the dry weight being smaller. So we see a greater incorporation of those elements in those plants. So we think, we're not all the way certain yet because we haven't got the data finished, that we're looking at that by using the PGR, you're basically improving your nutrient use efficiency by 23 to 33%. We still got to look at the data, but that's what it appears. And so you are getting better utilization of those nutrients. So you have an improvement of nutrient use with the use of a PGR. So there's a lot of additional benefits that we've talked about, and these benefits, besides the growth control, help on water use, post-harvest handling, establishment in the landscape, and so there's other benefits that go beyond just having that plant being smaller. And so those are why I've been on this roll for a while of saying, plant growth regulators are best management practices, and this data supports this, that we see an improvement in overall plant quality. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Okay, Brian. The first question is about Florel. Refers to Florel. Do any other PGRs besides Florel negatively impact rooting of annual unrooted cuttings?
There is an indication that the BAs can also have some negative impact on rooting. There's been some trials looking at applying Configure. That's a BA and GA. And at higher rates, you can also inhibit rooting with that chemical. Now, of the other PGRs that are there, and the next presentation I'm going to go on a little more on use of particular ones, but overdose rates of any of those PGRs are going to slow down root development on those plants, so it's too high of a rate. So that's why it's recommended to use some of the softer chemicals so you can avoid some of that overdose.
Okay. A question about does day length, a few different questions about other parameters that might affect PGR use. Does day length affect the quality of PGR use?
So I see the question that's there, day length, PGR. I'm going to hold off on the answer to that question, and the reason is Joyce Latimer is going to cover many of these factors in the last segment of today, and so that can come back. And if it's not fully answered, but Joyce is going to cover that.
Okay. Same with temperature and of the soil and leaf temperature.
I'm trying. She's going to talk about soil pH, or pH of the soil and pH of the solution. I would think, when we see the effects of on some of the bulb pre-plant soak work that Brian Krug actually did for one of his degrees, we saw that as temperature decreased, you saw less intake into a bulb. And I think, if you have less plant uptake or exposure, you're going to see some less effects occurring with that PGR, but it's probably going to be offset because cooler temperatures, lower light, you're going to have less plant growth anyway. So the key on some of the applications, some of these PGRs, is if it's the more potent ones like a Bonsai or a Sumagic or a Fluoropyrimidol, you want to get that plant getting up to basically the side of the pot and then make your application. Whereas the softer ones, because there's less residual effects and carryover with that chemical, you got to start earlier and control growth with multiple applications over time.
Okay, is there any other last minute questions that somebody would like to type in? That's all the questions that have come through so far. All right, well, we'll take a quick break from now until about 11:30 Eastern time. So you guys have about 5 minutes to take a quick break, and we'll come back here just before 11:30 for our next topic that Brian Whipper again from NC State will be presenting on how anti-GA PGRs work. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks.